say to my bride, let's go for a ride in my newfangled automobile. Just where we will go, nobody knows, but it's sure a great way to feel. Behind the wheel of the speed meter steel, it's my newfangled automobile.
Hello and welcome to Vintage Car History. I'm Wild Bill. Few cars in history have had such a profound impact upon a culture, a nation, and indeed an era than the Model T Ford. The Tin Lizzie was the best-selling car of the vintage era and amongst those of all time. In the 19-year production run, over 15 million rolled out of the factory and onto the roads, farms, and working lands of America and across the world. And today, we're going to take a look at how this car came into being and became a phenomenon. In 1903, Henry Ford established the Ford Motor Company, his third attempt at getting a car company up and running. This one was successful, and one of his early goals was to make a car that anyone could afford, operate, and also be rugged enough to survive the terrain of the United States. Certainly a lofty goal, and would take years of hard work to actually pull off. Now, there are lots of stories, rumors, and folklore surrounding Henry Ford from the first decade of the 20th century, and most of it comes from those reporting on the Selden trials. What stories were printed in the papers were based on the reporter's bias, and most of them were either highly exaggerated or complete fabrications, either for or against Ford. So, let's take a look at the indisputable facts. Ford himself was intelligent, received a reasonable education for the time, and was a competent, though not brilliant, engineer. His leadership skills and business acumen were second to none, and was keen to gather around him people who possessed the skills he needed to accomplish his goals. When he founded Ford Motor Company, he did so with two groups of people. He gathered one group, which were the investors that put up most of the money, and the other was the talent pool he'd need to make the company successful. First and foremost in this pool was Harold Wills. Wills was a truly brilliant engineer that had worked with Ford previously on his second company, and Ford brought him in to help design their first car, the 1903 Model A. Indeed, most of the car's features were the brainchild of Wills. A basic runabout, the car was a reasonable success, being suitable for local city or town use. But it lacked the power and stamina to traverse the rural country roads, if you could call them roads, that were scattered across America. Not long after the production of the Model A began, the Selden trials began. Fighting this lawsuit was going to be expensive, and Ford's financial backers wanted Ford to abandon the whole idea of a cheap, rugged car and make something to appease Alum. Wills did produce the Model K in 1906 to make them happy, but it was a failure. Its two-speed elliptical transmission flew apart when the 6-liter straight-six engine was given any throttle. Meanwhile, Ford and Wills continued to design new models, going through the alphabet, searching for just the right balance of utility, durability, and value in a production car. In January of 1907, Ford gathered his top three people, Wills, machinist C.J. Smith, and draftsman Joe Galum, and with a shout of, "To hell with Alum! This car will have everything every customer wants!" Ford set the criteria for this new car. First, it had to be simple to operate. As Ford himself said, "If you can ride a bike, you can drive this car." Second, it had to be easy to maintain and repair. Third, It had to be able to drive across the rutted cart paths and boggy open fields. And finally, it had to be cheap to manufacture and thus cheap to produce. Putting all of these requirements into one production car in 1907 was just about unthinkable, especially requirement number 4. Yes, cars could be and had been built to handle American roads up to that point, but they were definitely not cheap, and usually not very simple either. Making such a car would require being very creative in how it's produced, and Henry Ford was an expert at creative. As the team worked towards a design, they also worked on how to make it cheaply. 2 paths were obvious: make everything in-house and control the whole supply line, or farm out certain manufacturing needs to companies already equipped to do it. In the end, a mix of the two would be needed to get the Model T rolling. Ford purchased smaller companies that could supply the wood, vanadium steel, and other components, thus bringing much of the production in-house, while leaving some of the larger, more complex processes, such as casting engines, outsourced to local firms like the Dodge brothers. By September of the same year, the prototype Ford Model T was completed. Based on how it was made and the facilities they had on hand, it could be built and sold for $850. A lot of money at the time, but was definitely on the low end of the average car price. In 1907, that money would perhaps buy a runabout, which couldn't handle the rural terrain. So Ford and Wills took this car on a road trip over 1,300 miles in a big loop across the Midwest and returned unscathed. This car was exactly right. On October 1st, 1908, the Model T was offered for sale from your friendly neighborhood Ford dealer for the first time. It was equipped with a 2.9-inch 4-cylinder TN engine, making about 20 horsepower, an elliptical transmission with 2 forward speeds and a reverse. Brakes were by rear drums and a transmission brand. Several body styles were offered on the standard 100-inch wheelbase chassis: a 2-seater runabout, a 5-seater touring, and a 7-seat town car. At this point, the entire car was built by Ford and was offered along with their R and S models. A total of 11 Model Ts were built in the first month. But being the only car in America that could absorb the punishment of the land of the free, had the ground clearance to traverse the very rutted roads, and was well under $1,000, the people absolutely wanted this car, and that pace of production wouldn't do. Within weeks, demand absurdly outpaced supply, and Ford was in trouble. By the beginning of 1909, Henry was in a panic and sent a telegram to all of his dealers and sales staff: "Do not send any more Model T orders until advised by this office." Ford had no choice but to reorganize and refocus his production. In the late summer of 1909, he called a meeting of all his sales, marketing, and engineering staff. The purpose of the meeting was to work out the strategy for the Model T. And it was at this meeting that the famous quote of Ford's, "Any customer can have a car painted any color that he wants as long as it's black," was made. But in the context of the meeting, he really wasn't talking about paint colors, and indeed at the time black wasn't even offered as an option on the Model T. The choices were gray, red, blue, or green. At this point, over 10,000 Model Ts had been produced, making it the single best-selling car in the world. This was, of course, a great success, while also somewhat unexpected, and Ford was certainly not prepared for it. The sales of the R and S models had slumped accordingly, and both the sales and marketing team had a plan. use the Model T as the starter car for a customer, and update or replace the RNSs with more upscale offerings for those that have outgrown their Model Ts. I mean, mind you, this kind of strategy had been done successfully in Europe for decades, and the teams were quite passionate about their position. Henry was quite passionate about his position as well. The technology did not exist to keep up with the current demand. Therefore, efforts needed to be put into meeting said demand and developing that technology, rather than trying to slow down the growth of the Model T sales through putting out more product offerings. Now, both positions are very defendable and reasonable given the state of the American automobile industry in 1909. And at the end of the day, Henry's passion won the argument, and all of Ford's production focused solely on the Model T. Other companies, such as the previously mentioned Dodge brothers, were hired to help keep up the demand. Facilities were expanded, and in 1910 the factory was moved to the much larger Highland Park complex, where the Model Ts could be manufactured a la Olds and Cadillac style, and could build one in just 12 and a half hours. This was an astonishing pace, but it still wasn't enough. The great technological breakthrough came from Swift and Company, a slaughterhouse in Chicago. William Klon, one of the financial partners behind Ford, visited this company in early 1911 after hearing about their unprecedented efficiency. What he saw in this abattoir was a great series of chains and hooks suspended from the ceiling, yet on tracks that moved at irregular intervals. The carcasses were on the hooks, and the butchers each manned a station and cut a specific portion of the animal. Then the chains moved, and a new carcass was before the same butcher for him to repeat the process, while the one he had just worked on went to another butcher that prepared a different cut. Klon showed this principle to Henry, and he was all over it. Instead of a moving disassembly line, what about a moving assembly line? Could the concept work in reverse? Ford set his team to work on it, and by 1914, the Ford assembly line was up and running, and putting together a Model T went from 12 and a half hours to about 90 minutes. Ford could now actually meet the demand for the Model T, and the demand was relentless. That same year, the policy of all black was also implemented. The primary reasons being that black paint was cheap and switching colors around only slowed production. Europe went to war in 1914, and car production pretty much ceased there until 1919. Yet the USA's auto industry was not so hindered. As a result of both this situation and the new Ford moving assembly line, more Model Ts were built in 1915 than all other makes of cars across the world combined, with over 308,000 built. The Tin Lizzie, as she eventually became to be known by a long list of possible reasons, was now part of world culture. Songs were written about the car and its foibles. Movies were made featuring them, and of course, Laurel and Hardy tried to destroy them as fast as Ford could push them out. And with the increased manufacturing efficiency, the cost to make them went down, and so did the price. A basic runabout could be had for $390 by 1915, less than half the price of the 1909 model. This explosion of cars that were basically the same across the globe caused an explosion in the automotive aftermarket. Companies began to make parts and various kits to modify the Model T in all kinds of ways. You could upgrade the brakes, add an overdrive, turn it into a snowmobile or a tractor or a sawmill. Whatever you need your T to be, there was something in the Sears catalog that could make it happen. with over 15 million sold over 19 years. The establishment of Ford as just about an institution. The owners and enthusiasts driving their T's to this day on a sunny afternoon. This car created the motoring age in the U.S. and is iconic to American culture. But what is the greatest impact that the Model T has had on modern society? Allow me to postulate my own opinion for discussion. The Model T Ford established the economic basis of the modern information age. Now, I've heard, and I'm sure most folks watching this have as well, that in the old days, labor was cheap and technology was expensive. Nowadays, technology is cheap, but labor is expensive. Well, when did the old days cease? Can a specific point in history be nailed down that is the transition between the two worlds? In my opinion, the year was 1915. The old days were over. Technology was brought in that was not in and of itself extremely expensive to implement, but required skilled labor to do so. Ford redefined his labor force during this time. He implemented the 8-hour workday and the $5 minimum daily wage. Not much today, but at the time, you could support a family on that. He could do that because the technology placed on the assembly line required high-quality labor, and the increased production could support their higher pay. This had never been done in industry before, but it's the standard in just about all industries ever since. Use technology to make your labor force more efficient and therefore more valuable. And if they're more valuable, they need to be paid accordingly. This kind of thinking did not exist prior to the Model T. Thus, I submit that this car is indeed the demarcation point between what is old and what is new economically in the world today. The Model T would be in production through to 1927. By that time, most competitors had outpaced its design, and Henry Ford relented, his son Edsel designing the also well-beloved Model A in 1928. And to this day, it is hard not to smile when you see a Tin Lizzie on the road or perhaps parked, at a local Dairy Queen. Yet this funny, little, often laughable, yet very dependable car was perhaps the greatest driving force in creating the modern car-filled world. Thanks for watching Vintage Car History. We'll see you next week. Peace.